An elderly woman lost her daughter and grandson because of doctors. The case was closed. Years later, she opened her late grandson's piano. After that, the truth came out. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The house woke before she did, as it always had since the days when waking still meant something. Wood adjusted to the cold with quiet, patient creaks. Pipes sighed somewhere behind the walls. Outside, the street remained empty, sealed in early morning stillness, as if the world itself were holding its breath out of respect for what had been lost inside this building. She rose at the same hour every day, not because she needed to, but because sleep no longer claimed her beyond a certain point. Age had thinned it, grief had broken it, and habit merely finished the work. There was no alarm clock. There had not been one for years. She sat up slowly, waiting for the brief dizziness to pass, her feet finding the floor by memory rather than sight. The carpet was worn there, flattened by repetition. Everything in the house bore the marks of repetition. She moved through the morning with practiced precision. The kettle went on. 1 cup, always the same. Black tea, no sugar. The radio stayed off. The television, untouched, reflected her movements like a dark mirror. Sound felt intrusive now. Voices, laughter, even music felt like violations of a space that had learned to survive only by remaining silent. The phone lay on the kitchen table, screen dark. It was charged, always. She kept it that way out of habit, not hope. No one called anymore, not with anything that mattered. The lawyers had stopped long ago. The courts had spoken, then closed their mouths. Former colleagues sent messages on anniversaries at first, then less frequently, then not at all. Time had done what institutions could not. It had buried the story. After breakfast, she moved through the house room by room, not cleaning, merely passing through, as if counting losses by proximity. The hallway still carried faint pencil marks on the doorframe, recording the boy's height at different ages. 10 years old. He had been proud of that number. He had insisted it was important, that double digits meant something had changed. She had smiled then, indulgent and distracted, already believing in time as something endless. Her daughter's room remained exactly as it had been. Clothes folded, books aligned, the bed untouched, not preserved with care, but with refusal. Removing anything would have felt like admitting permanence, and permanence was something she still resisted, even now. The scent had faded, but not entirely. Sometimes, when the air shifted just right, it returned for a moment, sharp enough to stop her breath. She did not linger. Lingering led to remembering, and remembering led nowhere she could survive for long. The boy's room was worse, smaller, brighter, frozen mid-growth. School notebooks lay stacked on the desk, corners dog-eared. A backpack rested by the chair, still holding a crumpled worksheet she had never seen. His handwriting was everywhere, uneven and eager. She had read every word 100 times, but never all at once. Never as a whole. The courts had called it a complication, a rare outcome. The dentist had used the phrase, unfortunate coincidence. The hospital had issued statements filled with conditional verbs and passive constructions, language designed not to accuse anyone at all. By the time her daughter collapsed under the weight of hearings, expert opinions, and quiet professional indifference, the truth had already been filed away under acceptable loss. Her daughter had tried to be strong, too strong. Grief had worked on her slowly, invisibly, until one day it was clear she had been hollowed out from the inside. The heart attack came without drama. No warning, just another medical event, neatly documented, neatly closed. After that, the house had become what it was now, a structure holding absence. She paused near the living room doorway, as she always did. The piano stood against the far wall, covered with a thick cloth that dulled its shape. It might have been furniture or a coffin. She did not look directly at it. Some habits formed not from superstition, but from survival. Instead, she turned toward the study. The study was the only room that hinted at who she had once been. Shelves bowed under the weight of old files, folders thick with yellowed notes and photocopies, notebooks filled with shorthand, and margins crowded with corrections. Awards lay in drawers, metal tarnished, plaques unpolished. Her press credentials, expired and irrelevant, rested in a box beneath the desk. She had been a journalist once, not the kind who rewrote press releases or chased fleeting scandals, but one who stayed long enough for patterns to emerge. She had known how to read documents, how to listen without asking, how to wait. For decades, she had believed that truth, if handled carefully enough, could change things. That belief had not survived her family's case. She sat at the desk and opened a drawer without purpose, fingers brushing over a recorder she had not turned on in years. For a moment, a memory stirred of voices, tense rooms, the weight of responsibility. Then it settled back into silence. The rest of the day passed without distinction. Lunch eaten standing, a brief walk outside, coat buttoned against the wind, eyes down, avoiding neighbors who had learned to look away politely. By the time she returned home, the light had shifted, slanting through the windows at a lower angle, illuminating dust she rarely noticed. That was when she stopped in front of the piano again. She told herself she was only cleaning, that it meant nothing. The cloth was heavy with dust, fibers stiff. When she pulled it back, particles rose into the air, visible for a moment before settling again. The wood beneath was darker than she remembered, the surface dulled by time. She stood there longer than intended, hands resting on the edge, not yet lifting the lid. The house seemed to wait with her. For years, the piano had been the one object she could not touch. Not because it hurt more than the others, but because it promised sound. And sound meant presence. Sound meant interruption. She lowered herself onto the bench, slowly, as if afraid it might reject her. Her fingers hovered above the lid. She had no intention of playing. She had never learned. That had been for the boy, for later, for a future that never arrived. At last, she lifted the lid. The keys stared back at her, slightly yellowed, some more worn than others. Dust clung between them, stubborn and fine. She reached for a cloth and began to wipe, carefully, methodically, as if the act itself required discipline. She did not yet know that something inside the piano was waiting for her. But as she worked, as the house held its breath around her, something shifted. Not in the room, not in the air, but within her. A faint tension, like the tightening of a string that had been slack for years. The house where no one played had not been built for silence. It had only learned it. She told herself it was nothing more than cleaning. The word carried no emotion, no intention, only function. Cleaning was safe. Cleaning did not demand memory, did not ask questions, did not expect answers. It was something the hands could do while the mind remained elsewhere. Or so she believed. The cloth moved slowly across the surface of the piano, gathering years of dust into soft gray folds. With every pass, the wood beneath revealed itself, darker and warmer than she remembered, as if the instrument had been breathing quietly under its cover. Waiting, the smell rose with the dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic, a scent that belonged to rooms where time had been allowed to settle without interruption. She worked methodically, as she always had. Years in journalism had trained her hands as much as her mind. There was a rhythm to careful work, a pace that allowed details to emerge without being forced. She wiped the edges first, then the broad surface, then the narrow strip near the keys. Each movement was deliberate, restrained, as though she were afraid of waking something. When she lifted the fallboard, the keys appeared like a row of teeth, pale and unevenly worn. Some were smoother than others, their surfaces dulled by repeated contact. Her eyes followed the pattern instinctively, recognizing the places where a child's fingers would have returned again and again, practicing the same small phrases until muscle memory began to form. She had watched him once or twice, standing at a distance, pretending to read while listening with half her attention, not knowing then that those moments were finite. She began to clean between the keys, folding the cloth to fit the narrow spaces. Dust clung stubbornly there, settled deep where sound was born. As she worked, her thoughts drifted, not to the boy or to her daughter directly, but to the empty days that had followed them, to the way time had flattened itself into sameness, to how the house had grown accustomed to her moving through it without purpose. The cloth caught on something. At first she thought it was a splinter, a loose piece of felt, some forgotten remnant of the instrument's inner workings. She adjusted her grip and pulled again, gently. The resistance remained, slight but undeniable. Frowning, she leaned closer, peering into the narrow gap between the keys and the wooden frame. There was paper there. The sight of it felt unreal, as though the house had produced something it was not supposed to contain. Paper did not belong inside a piano. It was fragile, temporary, never meant to survive in such a place. Her hand hesitated, fingers hovering just above the keys, suspended between action and retreat. She could have closed the lid. She could have told herself it was nothing, that the paper would remain where it was, unseen and harmless. But the tension she had felt earlier tightened further, pulling her forward despite herself. Carefully, she slid 2 fingers into the gap and drew the object out. It was a small piece of paper, folded more than once, edges softened by time. Dust clung to it, dulling the white to a muted gray. She held it between thumb and forefinger, aware of the faint tremor that had begun in her hand. Her breath had shortened, without her noticing. She did not open it immediately. The paper itself already spoke. It carried a weight disproportionate to its size, a density she recognized from years of handling documents that mattered. This was not a receipt or a forgotten note. This was something placed with intention, something hidden. She unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases with the pad of her thumb. The handwriting revealed itself line by line, uneven and careful. Letters large in some places and cramped in others, as if the writer had been rushing and restraining himself at the same time. She recognized it instantly. The boy's handwriting had always been like that, eager but cautious. Each letter formed with effort, as though he were aware that writing made thoughts permanent and wanted to be sure they were worthy of staying. Seeing it again was not like remembering his voice or his face. It was more intimate than that. It was like touching the inside of his mind. Her eyes moved across the page, and the room seemed to recede as the words took shape. He had written about the piano, about practicing when no one was watching, about learning a melody he called secret, one he planned to play for her when she smiled again. The words were simple, direct, without ornament. He did not explain why he thought she needed that melody. He had simply known. She felt the first tear fall before she realized she was crying. It landed on the paper, darkening a small corner of the page. She brushed it away instinctively, as if afraid the ink might run, as if the words could still be damaged after all this time. At the bottom of the note, in smaller writing, there was something else. The handwriting changed there, the letters more controlled, the spacing more even. It was her daughter's hand. She had added a single line, almost as an afterthought, promising that they would come together soon, that the boy would play the melody himself, that there would be time. The sentence ended abruptly, without punctuation, as though she had been interrupted or had simply assumed there would be more opportunities to finish it later. There were none. The weight of it struck her all at once, not as a sharp pain, but as a collapse, something giving way inside her that had been held in place by routine and avoidance. She lowered herself onto the piano bench without meaning to, the note still clutched in her hand, her other hand gripping the edge of the instrument for balance. She had cried before, of course, in the first months, in the nights when sleep abandoned her entirely. Later, in quieter ways, brief and contained. But this was different. This was not grief erupting uncontrollably. This was grief finally being acknowledged. The house did not feel empty in that moment. It felt crowded with absence, filled with all the words that had not been spoken, all the sounds that had never been made. The silence pressed in on her from every side, no longer neutral, no longer bearable. She read the note again, and again. With each reading, something shifted. The boy's words were not a farewell. They were an expectation, a belief in continuity that had not known it was about to be betrayed. He had written from a future that no longer existed, but the sincerity of that future still lived in the ink. She realized then that the note was not only a memory, it was evidence. Not in a legal sense, not yet, but evidence of interruption, of a life cut short mid-sentence, of promises made casually because no one imagines they might be the last. She thought of the medical reports, the language that had reduced 2 deaths to a sequence of events, complication, reaction, unforeseeable outcome. The words had been chosen carefully, stripped of human context, designed to close the matter rather than explain it. This note refused closure. She folded the paper carefully and held it to her chest, feeling the faint crackle of it through her blouse. Her breathing slowed. The tears subsided, leaving behind a raw clarity she had not felt in years. For the first time since the house had fallen silent, she did not feel the urge to retreat from the memory. She felt drawn toward it, compelled to understand not just what had been lost, but how it had been taken. She looked around the room, at the piano, at the space where sound should have lived. The instrument no longer felt like a sealed tomb. It felt like a container, something that had been holding more than dust. She placed the note carefully on the piano, smoothing it flat, as if presenting it to the room. The gesture felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. The boy had hidden it there because he believed in the piano as a place of meaning. She would not dishonor that belief by treating it casually now. As the light outside shifted and the shadows lengthened, she remained seated, the note before her, her hands resting uselessly in her lap. She did not attempt to play. She did not touch the keys. That would come later, she sensed, but not yet. What she felt instead was the stirring of something she had thought long dead. Not hope, not exactly. Something closer to obligation, responsibility. She had once believed that truth was something external, something to be uncovered in documents and testimony. Now she understood that sometimes it arrived quietly, folded and hidden, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. The house had learned silence, but it had not erased sound entirely. It had merely postponed it. As evening settled in, she carefully folded the note again and placed it in the drawer of the desk in her study, atop old notebooks and yellowed files. It belonged there now, among records of things that mattered. When she turned off the light and left the room, she did not cover the piano again. The house noticed, and somewhere beneath the weight of years and dust, a melody waited, no longer content to remain unheard. That night did not bring sleep. It brought intervals of darkness broken by thought, by memory, by the quiet insistence of the folded paper now resting in the desk drawer downstairs. She lay in bed with her eyes open, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. The silence felt altered, no longer inert. It pressed less heavily, as though it had been disturbed and was unsure how to settle again. She rose before dawn and did not bother to dress properly. A sweater pulled over her nightgown, slippers on bare feet. The hallway felt longer in the half-light, the floorboards colder. When she reached the study, she turned on the desk lamp and sat without hesitation, opening the drawer where she had placed the note. She unfolded it carefully, as she had the evening before, and read it again. The words did not change, but her understanding of them did. The boy had not been writing from innocence alone. He had been writing from trust. Trust that adults knew what they were doing. Trust that systems worked. Trust that tomorrow arrived reliably. She closed her eyes and let the memories come. For years, her life had been built around questions. She had learned to live inside uncertainty, to treat official statements as invitations rather than answers. She remembered the early days of her career, the first investigation that taught her how quickly truth retreated when approached too directly, how sources hesitated, how institutions closed ranks, how patience, not aggression, was the real tool of the trade. She had been good at it, not fearless, but thorough. She had known when to press and when to wait, when to speak and when to listen. Editors had trusted her because she never brought them speculation disguised as fact. Everything she published could be traced, verified, defended. And yet, when it had been her daughter and grandson lying in hospital beds, when the language of reports replaced the language of concern, she had lost that clarity. Grief had collapsed her distance. She had wanted justice immediately, visibly, loudly. The system had responded by slowing down, by drowning urgency and procedure. She opened a folder from the bottom drawer. Medical records, neatly arranged, still bearing the official stamps that had once seemed authoritative. She read them now with a different eye. Phrases she had skimmed before now caught her attention. Passive constructions, absence of names, responsibility dissolved into process. She found the expert opinions next. The same consultant had appeared in more than one assessment. That had not seemed strange at the time. Specialists were rare, she had been told. Now it struck her as improbable, too convenient. She pulled out a notebook and began to write. Not emotionally, not accusatorily. Just questions. Dates that did not align. Timelines that compressed impossibly. The moment the boy's heart rate had dropped, the delay before intervention, the phrasing used to describe the response. She noted it all, her handwriting steady, familiar. The house grew lighter as morning approached, but she remained seated, moving from file to file. The more she read, the clearer the pattern became. The case had not been rushed because it was simple. It had been rushed because it needed to be closed. She remembered the hearing where the judge had spoken kindly, regretfully, explaining the limits of the court's authority. The moment when she realized that no one in the room was lying, and yet no one was telling the truth either. The truth, she now understood, had been fragmented deliberately, spread thin enough to be dismissed as coincidence. By the time the sun rose fully, she had filled several pages with notes. She leaned back in her chair and allowed herself to acknowledge what had been forming quietly in her mind. This was not about one mistake. This was about repetition. She stood and moved to the bookshelf, scanning the spines until she found what she was looking for. Old editions of medical journals, reports she had saved from past investigations, articles about regulatory oversight and private healthcare expansion. She had covered these topics years ago from a professional distance, never imagining they would circle back into her life so brutally. Her phone lay on the desk, still silent. She picked it up and scrolled through contacts she had not touched in years. Names stirred faint memories. An editor, who had once trusted her implicitly, a lawyer who specialized in institutional accountability, a doctor who had spoken off the record about systemic pressure and administrative shortcuts. She did not call yet. This stage required preparation. Impulse had cost her before. She would not repeat that mistake. Instead, she returned to the desk and spread the documents out, arranging them not by type, but by sequence. Cause and effect. Action and delay. She reconstructed the day of the procedure minute by minute, cross-referencing timestamps, staff schedules, protocol guidelines. The more she worked, the more her old instincts returned. Slotting pieces into place with unsettling ease, she felt no excitement, no satisfaction, only a growing sense of inevitability. The note lay beside her notebook now, unfolded, its presence steadying rather than painful. The boy had hidden it because he believed in discovery, in secrets that were meant to be found. She understood that now. By midday, she had identified 3 other cases, mentioned briefly in internal reports, dismissed with the same language, involving the same network of clinics, different cities, different patients, same outcome. Rare complications, clustered improbably close together. She closed her eyes and allowed herself a single, measured breath. This was not a matter for the courts. Not yet. Courts responded to conclusions. She was still assembling the truth. She spent the afternoon retrieving boxes from the attic, dusty and heavy, filled with the remnants of her professional life. Old notebooks, press passes, correspondence with sources long retired or deceased. As she sorted through them, she felt less like a grieving grandmother and more like herself. The woman who had once believed that careful attention could expose even the most protected wrongdoing. When evening came, she made herself eat, though she barely tasted the food. Her mind remained engaged, turning over possibilities, mapping connections. She considered the risks, not dramatically, but pragmatically. Pushback was inevitable. Discrediting attempts would follow. Age would be used against her. Grief would be framed as bias. She accepted all of it. That night, she returned to the study and locked the drawer containing the medical records and the note. The gesture felt symbolic, a boundary drawn between what had been and what was about to begin. She did not pray. She did not ask for strength. She had never believed in that kind of intervention. What she did was simpler. She decided. The past, long avoided, had returned not to haunt her, but to demand her attention. She would give it what it asked for. Not vengeance, not spectacle. Truth. And this time, she would not let it be filed away and forgotten. The decision she had made did not announce itself with urgency or fear. It settled into her like a familiar weight, heavy but balanced, the way responsibility always had. She woke the next morning without hesitation, without the aimless drift that had filled her days before. There was work to be done, and the clarity of that purpose shaped the hours ahead of her. She began where she always had, with documents. The medical records lay spread across the desk in careful order, no longer chaotic fragments, but components of a sequence she was learning to read with increasing precision. She returned to the reports she had already examined, this time not as a grieving relative, but as a journalist reacquainting herself with the habits of institutional language. She traced the phrases that appeared repeatedly, the passive verbs that dissolved agency, the careful absence of names where accountability should have been unavoidable. The same expressions appeared again and again. Unexpected reaction, rapid deterioration, all appropriate measures taken. Nowhere did the reports explain who had taken them, when, or why they had failed. The language was designed to reassure without informing, to conclude without revealing. She marked these sections in pencil, not angrily, but meticulously, as though cataloging a species whose behavior had become predictable. She turned next to the timelines. This was where systems betrayed themselves most clearly. Time resisted manipulation. It could be obscured, compressed, reinterpreted, but never fully erased. She aligned the timestamps from the procedure with the nursing logs, the medication records, the emergency response notes. The gaps emerged gradually, then unmistakably. Minutes unaccounted for. Intervals described vaguely or not at all. A delay that no report attempted to justify. She had seen this before, years ago, in an investigation unrelated to medicine. Different field, same instinct. When processes failed honestly, documentation became chaotic. When they failed deliberately, it became neat. By the end of the morning, she had begun a new list. Names of clinics, names of overseeing bodies, names of consulting specialists whose signatures appeared across multiple cases. She resisted the temptation to draw conclusions too quickly. Patterns required corroboration, not conviction. She accessed public records next, navigating databases she had once used daily and had not touched in years. The familiarity returned easily. Licenses, inspection reports, complaint summaries. The network emerged slowly, revealing itself not through scandal, but through repetition. Clinics changing names while retaining staff. Physicians transferring quietly between facilities just before inquiries began. Oversight reviews marked as resolved without explanation. She paused only when fatigue demanded it, stepping outside briefly to clear her head. The air felt sharper than usual, the world oddly intact despite what she was uncovering. People passed by unaware, engaged in lives untouched by the systems she was dissecting. It struck her then how invisible such failures remained, until they claimed someone specific, someone loved. Back at the desk, she began reaching out, cautiously at first. She did not announce herself as an investigator. She asked questions as a former colleague seeking understanding. Some conversations ended quickly, politely deflected. Others lingered in uneasy silence before the line went dead. But a few voices stayed. A retired nurse spoke to her anonymously, describing protocols bent under administrative pressure, corners cut to maintain throughput. A former clinic administrator hinted at directives issued verbally, never recorded, urging speed over caution. No one admitted to wrongdoing directly. They did not need to. Fear filled in the rest. As the days passed, resistance grew more tangible. Requests for comment went unanswered. One email was returned with a legal disclaimer attached. Another elicited a call from a public relations representative who spoke at length without saying anything at all. The message was clear. She was noticed. She welcomed that. Intimidation had never come early in honest cases. It arrived when proximity threatened exposure. Still, she took precautions. She backed up her files. She documented every interaction. She avoided speculation in her notes, adhering strictly to what could be demonstrated. Age had not dulled her discipline. If anything, it had refined it. What unsettled her most was not the obstruction, but the scale. As she expanded her search, similar cases surfaced beyond the initial network. Different regions, different oversight bodies, same outcomes. Rare complications occurring with unsettling frequency. Families describing identical experiences of dismissal and procedural closure. Lawsuits quietly settled with confidentiality agreements that ensured silence. This was not a failure of individual ethics. It was a system calibrated to absorb harm without consequence. One evening, as she reviewed a particularly dense inspection report, she realized how thoroughly the structure protected itself. Responsibility was fragmented across layers so numerous that no single entity appeared culpable. Regulators deferred to clinical judgment. Clinics deferred to consultants. Consultants deferred to accepted risk. At every turn, accountability dissolved into abstraction. She thought of the boy's note, folded carefully in her desk drawer, of his certainty that practice led to music, that patience produced reward. The contrast felt almost unbearable. A child had believed in continuity. The system had believed only in insulation. She began drafting the framework for publication, though she did not write a word intended for readers yet. This stage belonged to architecture, not expression. She mapped relationships, financial ties, regulatory overlaps. She outlined the chronology of failures, noting where oversight should have intervened and did not. Each point required verification from at least 2 sources. Anything less would weaken the structure. Attempts to discourage her intensified subtly. An old acquaintance suggested, with forced concern, that revisiting the case might reopen wounds best left closed. Another hinted that public attention could lead to scrutiny of her own past reporting. She listened without reaction. These were familiar tactics, and familiarity stripped them of power. What troubled her more were the moments of doubt that came in quieter hours. She wondered whether her proximity to the loss compromised her objectivity, whether grief, however controlled, colored her interpretation. Each time the thought surfaced, she returned to the documents. Facts, she reminded herself, did not change with emotion. They remained, or they did not. By the end of the second week, she no longer questioned the existence of a pattern. The evidence had crossed that threshold quietly, without spectacle. What remained was to present it in a form that could not be dismissed. She selected a small, independent publication for the first release, one that valued depth over reach. The editor, a former colleague, read her preliminary findings without interruption. When he finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked for sources. She gave them. The silence that followed was different from the one in her house. It was charged, anticipatory. She recognized it from past investigations, the moment before something irreversible entered public space. That night, as she returned home, the piano stood uncovered in the living room, its dark surface catching the low light. She did not touch it. She did not need to. Its presence was enough. The system she was confronting had learned to survive by repetition, by making failure appear random and inevitable. She understood now that its greatest vulnerability lay in the same place. Patterns, once named, did not disappear. They demanded response, and she was ready to give them one. The article did not appear with fanfare. There was no headline designed to provoke outrage, no dramatic photograph, no attempt to compress the story into something easily consumed. It was published quietly, early in the morning, on a weekday, when most people were preoccupied with the mechanics of their own lives. The editor had insisted on restraint. She had agreed. This was not a story that needed to shout. It needed to stand. She read the published version once, slowly, not as its author, but as a reader who had no personal stake in the outcome. The facts held. The structure was sound. Each claim rested on documentation, each connection supported by corroboration. Names appeared only where responsibility could be demonstrated. Where certainty ended, the text acknowledged it plainly. There was no speculation, no emotional appeal, only accumulation. By noon, the first responses began to arrive. They were tentative at first, emails from readers who recognized details, who had experienced similar outcomes, and had been told, as she had, that nothing more could be done. Some messages were brief, almost apologetic, as though the writers feared intruding. Others were long, spilling over with frustration that had waited years for a place to land. She read them all, cataloging not just the stories, but the language. The same phrases surfaced again and again. Rare complication. Unavoidable outcome. Review complete. By the following day, Other journalists had taken notice, not the ones who chased daily outrage, but those who understood how systems hid behind process. Requests for interviews came in cautiously, framed as conversations rather than challenges. She answered selectively, always returning the focus to the evidence. This was not her story, she insisted. It belonged to the documents. The institutions named in the article responded as expected. Carefully worded statements expressed sympathy without admission, concern without commitment. Internal reviews were announced. Cooperation was promised. She recognized the choreography. It was designed to appear responsive while buying time. But something had shifted. The families began to speak publicly. Once one did, others followed. Faces appeared where only statistics had existed before. The repetition she had documented in reports now echoed in personal accounts, told in different voices, but following the same arc. Procedures described as routine, complications framed as tragic anomalies. Grief managed through silence. Regulatory bodies could no longer treat the issue as isolated. Questions were raised in hearings, not accusatory at first, but persistent. Why had oversight failed to identify the pattern earlier? Why consultants had been reused across cases? Why internal reviews had produced no corrective action? She watched from a distance, declining invitations to appear on television panels. She had learned long ago that spectacle diluted substance. Instead, she continued to work, providing additional documentation as requested, clarifying timelines, responding to challenges with calm precision. The pressure intensified quickly. Clinics named in the article suspended operations temporarily, citing caution. Several physicians were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Licensing boards announced audits that extended beyond the initial cases. What had begun as one publication now spread across jurisdictions, its implications too broad to contain. Privately, she felt nothing like triumph. The sense that accompanied these developments was closer to exhaustion, tempered by a sober acknowledgement that this phase was no longer hers to control. Systems responded, not because they were convinced, but because they were exposed. Accountability, when it came, did so slowly, unevenly, shaped by legal frameworks and political calculation. One evening, she received a call from a lawyer representing several families. He thanked her without embellishment and asked whether she would be willing to testify if proceedings advanced. She said yes, without hesitation. Not out of anger, but out of consistency. She had followed the facts to this point. She would not abandon them now. Attempts to undermine her credibility surfaced soon after. An opinion piece questioned whether personal loss had compromised her objectivity. A commentator suggested that her age made her vulnerable to misinterpretation of technical data. She did not respond. The evidence spoke more clearly than rebuttal ever could. Weeks passed. Clinics closed permanently. Licenses were revoked. In some cases, criminal investigations were opened, not for individual errors, but for systemic misrepresentation and negligence. The language shifted, subtly but decisively. What had once been framed as unfortunate coincidence was now discussed in terms of preventability. Through it all, she remained largely invisible. Her role receded as others carried the story forward. Younger reporters expanded the scope. Advocacy groups mobilized. Policy discussions emerged. The machinery of response, slow and imperfect, began to turn. At home, the House absorbed these changes without comment. It remained quiet, but the quiet no longer felt like a void. She noticed small differences in herself. Meals prepared with more attention. Windows opened longer. The phone answered more often. She did not feel relief. Relief implied an end. And this was not an ending. It was a correction, partial and overdue. Her daughter and grandson remained gone. No outcome altered that fact, but their absence was no longer isolated, sealed within private grief. It had been connected to something larger, something that could be addressed. One afternoon, as she reviewed a final set of documents confirming the permanent closure of the clinic where the procedure had taken place, she allowed herself to pause. The sense of obligation that had driven her for months loosened slightly, not disappeared, but eased. She closed the file and sat back, aware for the first time of her own fatigue. It was the honest kind, earned rather than imposed, the kind that followed completion. That evening, she stood in the living room, looking at the piano. The note remained in the desk drawer, where it had been since the beginning of her work. She had not taken it out again. She had not needed to. Its purpose had been fulfilled, not by being remembered endlessly, but by initiating movement. She understood then that what she had done was not justice in any absolute sense. Justice was a word systems used as a destination, though it rarely arrived intact. What she had achieved was exposure, illumination, the removal of plausible deniability. It was enough. The truth, once brought into the open, no longer belonged to her alone. It had entered the world, imperfect and contested, but undeniable. And with that realization came something unexpected. Silence, not as oppression, but as space. For the first time since the boy's death, she did not feel compelled to fill it with work. There was something else waiting, something she had postponed long enough. When the noise receded, it did so without ceremony. There was no final announcement, no moment she could point to and say that everything had ended there. The calls simply became less frequent. The emails slowed, then stopped. The editor sent a short message thanking her again, not for the story, but for her patience. The lawyer informed her that proceedings would continue without her direct involvement unless something changed. Nothing did. One morning she woke and realized there was nothing she urgently needed to do. The realization unsettled her more than the work ever had. For months, purpose had carried her forward, narrowing her days into manageable sequences. Now that structure dissolved, leaving behind hours that stretched open and undefined. She sat at the kitchen table longer than usual, tea cooling in her cup, listening to the house settle around her. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It no longer pressed against her chest. It waited. She moved through the rooms slowly, without the old avoidance. The study no longer felt like a command center. The desk no longer demanded attention. Files were stacked neatly, labeled and stored. The drawer containing the note remained locked, not out of fear, but out of respect. Some things did not need to be revisited endlessly to retain their meaning. When she reached the living room, she stopped. The piano stood uncovered, exactly where she had left it weeks earlier. Light from the window traced the curve of its body, settling on the keys. Dust had begun to gather again, lightly this time, a reminder that objects, like people, existed within time whether attended to or not. She sat on the bench without thinking about it. The motion felt different now, less tentative, less ceremonial. She placed her hands on her lap and allowed herself to simply look at the instrument. It no longer felt like a monument to absence. It felt unfinished. She opened the side compartment and removed the old music books she had seen before, but never touched. The boy's practice notebook lay among them, pages creased and smudged. She opened it carefully. Simple exercises filled the early pages, lines uneven, notes labeled in pencil. Toward the middle, a melody appeared, halting but deliberate. The same one he had mentioned in his note. She did not know how to read music properly. That fact would have once stopped her entirely. Now it merely slowed her down. She carried the notebook to the table and studied it the way she had studied documents during the investigation. Not with expertise, but with attention. Patterns emerged. Repetition. Progression. The melody was simple, built on expectation rather than complexity. It was meant to be learned, not admired. She returned to the piano and placed the notebook on the stand. Her fingers hovered above the keys, uncertain, slightly stiff. Age had left its mark there, too. The joints protested faintly as she pressed the first key. The sound startled her. It was not loud. It was not beautiful. But it was sound, unmistakable and present, filling the room in a way silence never had. She lifted her finger and pressed again, this time with intention. Another note followed, then another. The sequence was broken, uneven, but recognizable. She played for only a few minutes before stopping. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from something closer to awe. She had not expected the act itself to carry such weight. Playing was not remembering, it was participating. Over the following days, she returned to the piano often, sometimes for only a few minutes, sometimes for longer stretches. She made mistakes constantly. Notes blurred together. Timing slipped. But she did not correct herself harshly. The boy's handwriting in the notebook had never been perfect. Precision was not the point. As she practiced, memory surfaced without overwhelming her. She remembered him sitting upright, feet barely reaching the pedals, brow furrowed in concentration. She remembered her daughter standing nearby, smiling quietly, unwilling to interrupt. These recollections did not crush her now. They accompanied her. The house responded subtly. She noticed it in the way sound carried down the hallway, and how the rooms no longer felt sealed off from one another. The piano's voice, tentative as it was, threaded through the space, softening its edges. One afternoon, she unlocked the drawer and removed the note. She read it once more, then placed it gently inside the practice notebook. It belonged there, she realized. Not hidden, not displayed. Integrated. The melody improved slowly, not in complexity, but in continuity. She learned where her hands needed to move before they arrived there. She learned to pause without stopping, to let one note resolve before reaching for the next. The act required patience, the same patience she had once applied to investigations, now redirected inward. She understood, gradually, what the boy had meant. The melody was not meant to impress. It was meant to endure, to exist long enough to be shared. When she finally played it through without interruption, she did not notice at first. It ended simply, without flourish. Her hands rested on the keys, the final note fading into the room. She sat there, breathing evenly, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. And that was when she realized she had been waiting for the wrong thing. There was no release, no sudden peace, no sense of completion that erased what had come before. What there was instead was alignment. The past and the present occupying the same space without conflict. She had not been there when it mattered most. That truth remained. But she had listened now. She had answered in the only way still available to her. As evening settled in, she closed the piano gently and stood. The house felt full, not of noise, but of presence. She moved through it with ease, no longer avoiding certain doorways, no longer bracing herself against memory. The silence returned after the music, but it was no longer empty. It held what had been played, what had been learned, what had been carried forward. She turned off the lights one by one and climbed the stairs, unhurried. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, and she would meet it without resistance. The melody remained, and for the first time in years, she knew that was enough. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. New stories like this are coming, and the next one is already waiting for you. Watch more videos on the channel, and if you feel this story should be heard, share it with others.